Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Scriptura. In this video, we'll walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 16. These are issues that anyone who's doing serious study of this psalm is going to have to deal with, and each of these 3 issues impacts how you understand the meaning of the psalm as a whole. The top 3 issues in Psalm 16 are all about the text and interpretation of verses 2, 3, and 4. And really, there aren't just 3 issues, but a whole cluster of issues that span across these 3 verses. So in this video, we'll work through these 3 verses one at a time. So the first issue will focus on verse 2, the second will focus on verse 3, and the third on verse 4. And for all of these issues, if you're interested in seeing more evidence and more detailed argumentation, you can find it at our website, linked in the description below. We have a whole page dedicated to each of these 3 issues, or each of these 3 verses, which in this video we only have time to discuss briefly. The first issue for Psalm 16 is the text and interpretation of verse 2. And we can illustrate the key issues in this verse by comparing 2 translations. The King James Version says, "O my soul, thou hast said unto the Lord, Thou art my Lord, my goodness extendeth not to thee." And then the New Jewish Publication Society translation says, "I say to the Lord, You are my Lord, my benefactor. There is none above you." There are 2 key differences between these translations. The first difference is in the first half of the verse, "you say," or "thou hast said" in the KJV versus "I say" in the NJPS. And the second difference is in the second half of the verse, "my goodness extendeth not to thee" versus "my benefactor. There is no one above you." The first issue, the first difference, reflects a difference in vocalization in the underlying Hebrew text. So in the Masoretic text, verse 2 begins with the word amar. This is a second-person feminine singular verb. You say, or you have said. So when the KJV has "thou hast said," it's following the vocalization of the Masoretic text. But this vocalization, this second-person feminine verb, raises an issue. Who or what is the subject of this verb? So far, the psalm has mentioned the Lord and the psalmist, both in verse 1. But neither of these can be the subject of a feminine singular verb. So who is the subject of "you say," amar? And this is where the King James Version, following a long-standing Jewish tradition, interprets the subject as the psalmist's soul. "O my soul, thou hast said unto the Lord." The Hebrew word for soul, nephesh, is feminine, and so it would work as the subject of the feminine verb, amar. Now, the underlying text doesn't actually say, "O my soul," but the translators have added it to make the text clear, and they've put it in italics to show that it's not actually explicit in the text, but in their view, it's implied. But then why does the NJPS translation, along with most modern translations, have a first-person singular verb? I say. It's because some Hebrew manuscripts, along with most of the ancient versions, have a first-person verb here, amarti. The Septuagint, for example, our oldest witness to the text, has the first-person verb epa. I said. And at least 20 or so medieval Hebrew manuscripts read amarti with a first-person yod ending instead of amart, the second person. And the first person reading makes good sense in the context. In the previous verse, the psalmist says, "I take refuge in you." And so it makes sense that in the next verse, he would continue speaking in the first person. "I take refuge in you. I say to the Lord," or have said to the Lord, "You are my Lord." So the first person vocalization of the verb, amarti, is definitely more natural. By contrast, the second person vocalization, "you said," amart, would imply a subject that has not even been mentioned in the psalm. For example, the psalmist's soul. But if the first person reading is so straightforward, so much more natural, then how do we explain the second person reading of the Masoretic text? How did that come about? After all, isn't it a maxim of textual criticism that the more difficult reading is probably the earlier reading, and the easier reading is more likely to be secondary? Well, that's often true. But in this case, it's easy to explain how the more difficult second-person feminine singular vocalization of the Masoretic text could have arisen secondarily. The earliest recoverable form of the text most likely read amarti without any vowel points and without a final yod, which would indicate explicitly a first-person verb. So in other words, the spelling in the original text was defective. The final yod vowel was not represented by a consonant, and the defective spelling apparently led some early interpreters to read the verb as a second-person feminine singular, amart, and this interpretation stuck, and it influenced the vocalization of the text in the Masoretic tradition. So we should probably read the verb amarti as a defectively spelled first-person singular verb. So I say, or I have said. But now there's another issue. In the second half of the verse, the KJV says, "My goodness extendeth not to thee." Other modern translations say something like, "I have no good apart from you." And what all of these translations have in common is that they read the second half of verse 2 as a complete clause, with the phrase, "my good," tovati, as the subject. In Hebrew, the second half of the verse says, "Tovati bal alecha." Now this could mean, "my good is not above you," or "my good is not besides you," or apart from you. Ancient interpreters, modern interpreters, have struggled to make sense of this clause. In our view, the reason for the difficulty, the difficulty in explaining the syntax of tovati balalecha, is because it isn't actually a clause. Instead, the text reads much more naturally if the phrase "my good," tovati, instead of being the subject of a new clause, is actually continuing the clause from the previous line. So for example, the NJPS says, "I say to the Lord, you are my Lord, my benefactor," or more literally, "you are my Lord, my good." And then the last two words, balalecha, are a new clause. "There is no one above you." This interpretation is grammatical. It has clear parallels elsewhere, and it makes good sense in the context of the psalm. The psalmist is pledging his allegiance to the Lord alone. "You are my Lord, you are my good." That is, you are the source of all my good, my benefactor. For me, he says, there is no one above you. You are the greatest, and you have my highest allegiance. If asked to rate our level of confidence in how we understand this verse on a scale of A to D, A being the highest, D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a B rating. The second issue, or really the second group of issues, is in verse 3. Now, Psalm 16:3 is one of the most difficult verses in the whole Psalter. Modern translators have described it as uncertain, obscure, very obscure, and difficult. And so it's no surprise that, as one translation explains, this sentence has given rise to several different translations, and that's putting it rather mildly. Now, there isn't enough time in this video to explore all of the possible translations. If you're interested in that kind of detail, you can visit our website, linked in the description below. Instead, what we want to do in this short video is just lay out our preferred interpretation of verse 3. Before doing that, let me just say two things about our interpretation. First, be aware that it is somewhat unique. And second, although it's unique among modern translations, it follows the Masoretic text completely. Many of the most popular translations of this verse deviate from the Masoretic text in one way or another, even if it's just removing a vav conjunction or shifting around the accentuation. But our interpretation follows the Masoretic text. Vowels, consonants, accentuation, and in our view, the Masoretic text makes sense in the context and the way that we've decided to interpret it. So let's look at the text together. The text of verse 3 says, "Likdoshim esher ba'aretz hema, va'adirei kol cheftzifam." Now here's how we've translated this. "They are on the side of the holy ones who are in the earth. The all my pleasure is in them, mighty ones." Let me break down this interpretation and explain how we got to this translation. We interpret the first half of the verse as a simple verbless clause. The subject is the pronoun hema, they, and the complement, the predicate complement, is the prepositional phrase likdoshim asher ba'aretz, which we've translated "on the side of the holy ones who are in the earth." The lamed preposition, le, likdoshim, it indicates belonging, in this case belonging to someone's side. And so the first half of the verse says, they, hema, they are on the side of the holy ones, likdoshim, who are in the earth, esher ba'aretz. We find a similar syntactic construction, for example, in Joshua 5:13. One day, Joshua was near Jericho when he saw a man standing some distance in front of him. The man was holding a sword. So Joshua walked up to him and asked, "Are you on our side or on our enemy's side? Halanu ata im letzarenu. Similarly, in Psalm 16:3, the psalmist is saying that they are on the side of the holy ones, likdoshim, who are in the earth, asher ba'aretz. So now this raises two questions. Who are the holy ones? And second, who are they? That is, who are the ones who are on the side of the holy ones? Now the text itself clarifies who the holy ones are. It says that they are the holy ones who are in the earth. Now why would you add that extra detail? Why would you specify in that way with a relative clause? If you were just talking about, for example, God's people, his saints, his holy ones, as a number of translations think, then why would you need to specify that they are ba'aretz, that they are in the earth or in the land? We would suggest that the phrase in the earth, ba'aretz, specifies that the holy ones are specifically underworld spirits or underworld deities. So the phrase in the earth literally means in the earth or in the underworld. There are other passages in the Bible that use the word holy ones, kadoshim, to describe spiritual beings. And the Bible also talks about spiritual beings who are associated with the underworld. And it uses the phrase or the word the earth to describe where they reside. So a clear example of this is in 1 Samuel 28, where Saul consults the medium of Endor, has her raise the dead prophet Samuel, and the medium says to Saul, I see a God coming up out of the earth. I see an Elohim coming up out of the Aretz, the earth, or the underworld. This is how we understand the background of verse 3. It's describing people who, like Saul, reject the Lord and side themselves instead with the holy ones who are in the earth. People like Saul who turn to the underworld, the spirits of the underworld, for help and guidance. As we'll see, this interpretation also makes sense of verse 4, which is about people who worship other gods. Their idols increase, it says, they have acquired another. I will not pour out their drink offerings of blood, and I will not utter their names with my lips. And as we discuss on our website, there's some evidence for associating drink offerings of blood with the worship of the dead, with consulting dead spirits. So our interpretation of verse 3 makes sense in the wider context of verses 3 and 4. Well, the second question is, who are they? They are on the side of the holy ones who are in the earth. And this question is a little more difficult to answer because up to this point, the text has not explicitly mentioned any group of people to whom this pronoun they might refer. But it could be that they, hema, refers to an implicit group of people who are threatening the psalmist. The psalm begins in verse 1, protect me, God. This request for protection implies a situation of danger. The psalmist needs protection because, presumably, others are trying to harm him. So although a group of bad people are not explicitly mentioned before verses 3 and 4, they're implied. They're part of the careful listener's mental representation, and so they're accessible. And the speaker can refer to them in verse 3 with a pronoun, they. They are on the side of the holy ones who are in the earth. Okay, now what about the second half of verse 3? The Hebrew text says, Va'adirei kol chefzivam. And we have translated this, the second half of the verse, as a continuation of the clause in verse 3a. They are on the side of the holy ones. The all my pleasure is in them, mighty ones. The whole line of verse 3b is one big construct chain. Adirei is the head of the construct chain, the mighty ones of, and then the rest of the construct chain is an embedded clause. Kol chefzivam. So literally, the mighty ones of, all my pleasure is in them. Or you could say, as we have in our CBC translation, the all my pleasure is in them, mighty ones. The clause, all my pleasure is in them, is a description of these mighty ones. But who are these mighty ones? And we would suggest that the mighty ones are another way of referring to the holy ones in the preceding line. The two phrases are poetically parallel and semantically they're co-referential. There are other passages, both in the Hebrew Bible and in other cognate literature, where the adjective mighty, adir, is used to describe a god or a spiritual being. So it makes sense that the mighty ones are simply another way of referring to the holy ones, that is, to the underworld spirits. They were mighty in their life and now they have died and are residing residing in the earth, where other people supposedly can bring them up and consult them, like Saul did with Samuel. But who are the ones saying, all my pleasure is in them? In light of the parallel line, the first half of the verse, they are on the side of the holy ones. It makes sense that the ones saying, all my pleasure is in them, would be the same people who are on their side, the same they from the first half of the verse. In other words, the phrase, all my pleasure is in them, doesn't reflect the psalmist's attitude, but instead it reflects the attitude of his enemies, the attitude of those who side themselves with these underworld deities. The first person singular, my pleasure, is not the psalmist's, but it's what these other people say about the mighty ones. So, in conclusion, although this verse is very difficult, we can make sense of it without resorting to textual emendation, like so many translations do. The interpretation we've outlined here is based on solid textual evidence. It follows the Masoretic text, vowels, consonants, accentuation. It's grammatically viable, and it also makes sense in the context of the psalm. But because it's admittedly unique in the history of interpretation, we've not found this interpretation anywhere, we only recommend it with a D rating. For more details on our interpretation, you can visit our website, linked in the description below. The third issue, or the third group of issues, is in the next verse, verse 4. Before looking at the issues in verse 4, it will be helpful to review how we have interpreted verses 2 and 3. We've translated verses 2 and 3 as, I have said to the Lord, you are my Lord, my good, there is no one above you. They are on the side of the holy ones who are in the earth, the all my pleasure is in them, mighty ones. So verse 2 is a declaration of faithfulness to the Lord, and then verse 3 is a description of those who are unfaithful. The psalmist contrasts his faithfulness, his allegiance to the Lord, with the faithlessness of others, perhaps his enemies. And that brings us to verse 4. We understand verse 4 as a continuation of verses 2 and 3. In the first part of verse 4, he continues to describe the faithlessness of his enemies, and in the second part of verse 4, he renounces their behavior. He refuses to participate in that kind of idolatrous worship, and he again shows his commitment to the Lord alone as his Lord and his good. So in other words, our understanding of verses 2 and 3, which we've worked out in the preceding issues, has a strong influence on how we understand verse 4. The first clause of verse 4 says, Yirbu atzavotam, and we interpret this to mean their idols increase. This is a straightforward interpretation of the Masoretic text that makes sense with the preceding context. The only difficulty here is that the normal word for idols is masculine, whereas the noun here is feminine, atzavot, instead of, we would expect, utzabim. But there are numerous examples in biblical Hebrew of inanimate nouns having both masculine and feminine forms, and the two forms are basically synonymous. So we would understand the feminine atzavot as a biform of the more common masculine noun utzabim. So the first clause in verse 4 says, their idols increase. And then the next clause in verse 4 says, acher maharu, which we have translated as, they have acquired another. The verb maharu, they have acquired, maharu, as it's vocalized in the Masoretic text, occurs just one other time in the Bible. Exodus 22:16 says, if a man entices a virgin that is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay a dowry for her, mahor yimharenu, to be his wife. In this Exodus passage, the verb mahar in the Cal stem, the only other occurrence outside of Psalm 16, means pay a dowry for, or pay a bride price for. And this can work in the context of Psalm 16. Their idols increase, they have paid the bride price for another one. In other words, the people who are on the side of the underworld deities who worship these gods are bringing themselves, have brought themselves into a marriage-like relationship with these gods. Their sacrifices to them, their drink offerings of blood, are like bride prices that tie them to these spirits, and in so doing, they violate their covenant relationship with the God of Israel. There are many other ways to read this verse and the previous verses, but this is how we've come to make sense of it. There wasn't enough time in this video to engage with all of the possible interpretations, and so we've simply tried to lay out our preferred view. We give our preferred interpretation of verse 4 a C rating. If you're interested in more details on any of these issues and in exploring other possibilities, we encourage you to visit our website. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see Psalm 16 as a whole. In verse 2, the psalmist declares that the Lord is his highest authority, his Lord or his master, and his highest good. There is no one above the Lord. And then this declaration in verse 2 sets up the contrast in the next verse with those who worship other gods. So in verse 3, he describes others, maybe his enemies, who turn to underworld spirits in times of crisis. People like Saul, who consult the dead for guidance. Instead of delighting in the Lord, these people take pleasure in the so-called mighty ones who have died and are now buried in the earth. In verse 4, the psalmist continues to describe these people as idolaters, and he refuses to participate in worshiping their gods. I will not pour out their drink offerings of blood or utter their names with my lips. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 16, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. All of our videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at scriptura.org to learn more.